The water was gone by late September 2005. That's when residents were finally allowed back into most neighborhoods. They came with cameras, garbage bags, and a kind of hope that would not survive the day. The streets were dry but marked. Water lines on houses showed how high it got, 15 feet in some places, uniform across entire blocks, like someone had drawn a level line with a pen the width of a city. Inside the houses, everything below that line was ruined or gone. Above it, things looked almost normal. A wedding photo still hung on the wall, a calendar frozen on August. The juxtaposition made it worse somehow. What struck people most was the silence. New Orleans had never been silent. The city had always hummed with something: music, voices, traffic, life. Now it sounded like a set after filming wrapped. Structures present, inhabitants not. Refrigerators sat on curbs, duct-taped shut. Everyone knew what was inside. FEMA would eventually collect over 35,000 refrigerators from New Orleans alone. By October, maybe 20,000 people were back in a city that had held nearly 500,000. Schools didn't reopen on schedule. Of the 128 public schools operating before Katrina, only 17 reopened by December 2005. Parents who returned with children had nowhere to send them. Some families homeschooled in houses with no electricity. Others sent their kids to schools an hour away in neighboring parishes. Charity Hospital, which had served the city since 1736, never reopened. It still hasn't. The patients went elsewhere. The staff went elsewhere. The building stands empty today. 20 stories of broken windows in the middle of downtown. Entire systems that make a city functional simply stopped. Mail delivery was sporadic. Some neighborhoods got service, others didn't, with no clear pattern. Garbage collection happened when it happened. The fire department operated with a third of its previous staff. Streetlights stayed dark for months in some areas. Traffic signals didn't work, turning every intersection into a negotiation. You could return to your house, but you couldn't return to your life. The infrastructure of daily existence had collapsed, and nobody could say when or if it would be rebuilt. Homeowners came back at higher rates than renters. People with cars came back more than people without. White residents returned at higher rates than black residents. This wasn't about choice, it was about resources. If your job disappeared, you couldn't afford to come back unemployed. The restaurant where you worked was gone. The store where you clerked was gone. If you'd been renting and your building was condemned, you had nothing to return to. No lease, no claim, no legal standing. If you'd evacuated to Houston or Atlanta or Dallas and found work there, found schools for your kids there, found apartments that weren't flooded, the equation changed. Why return to uncertainty when you'd already started rebuilding elsewhere? The people who came back first were the ones who could afford to wait for the city to function again. By 2006, the population had recovered to about 230,000, less than half what it had been. The missing 250,000 people weren't visiting relatives, they were gone. Homeowners came back at higher rates than renters. People with cars came back more than people without. White residents returned at higher rates than black residents. This wasn't about choice, it was about resources. If your job disappeared, you couldn't afford to come back unemployed. The restaurant where you worked was gone. The store where you clerked was gone. If you'd been renting and your building was condemned, you had nothing to return to. No lease, no claim, no legal standing. If you'd evacuated to Houston or Atlanta or Dallas and found work there, found schools for your kids there, found apartments that weren't flooded, the equation changed. Why return to uncertainty when you'd already started rebuilding elsewhere? The people who came back first were the ones who could afford to wait for the city to function again. By 2006, the population had recovered to about 230,000, less than half what it had been. The missing 250,000 people weren't visiting relatives. They were gone. Pre-Katrina New Orleans had a poverty rate of 28%, one of the highest in the nation. By 2015, it was down to 27%, which sounds like improvement until you realize what it actually meant. Poverty didn't decrease. The poorest residents never came back. The median household income rose, not from prosperity, but from displacement. The people who returned had resources, savings, insurance, family support networks, jobs waiting for them. The people who stayed away didn't. Insurance payouts went to homeowners. Renters got nothing. Federal rebuilding grants required proof of ownership and matching funds. If you'd rented for 30 years in the same neighborhood, that counted for nothing. If you couldn't afford the upfront cost of repairs while waiting for reimbursement, you couldn't rebuild. The disaster didn't just damage the city, it filtered the population by wealth. The New Orleans that emerged was statistically less poor because it had expelled its poorest residents through a system that rewarded property ownership and punished everyone else. New Orleans in 2010 was 30% whiter than it had been in 2000. The black population dropped from 67% to 60% of the total. Not because people chose to leave permanently, but because return became impossible for many. The new arrivals were often young, often white, often drawn by cheap rent in a historic city with damaged infrastructure and desperate need for workers. They came as teachers through Teach for America, as volunteers with AmeriCorps, as entrepreneurs seeing opportunity in crisis. They opened coffee shops and art galleries in neighborhoods that had never had them. They started nonprofits focused on recovery and revitalization. They meant well. Most of them genuinely wanted to help. But they were replacing, not restoring. The culture shifted in subtle ways. Rents rose in neighborhoods that had been affordable for generations. Landlords now knew outsiders would pay more. Corner stores became artisan bakeries. The city grew hipper and hollower at the same time. It looked vital from the outside, but the vitality was new, not renewed. Neighborhoods are not buildings. They're networks of people who knew each other, helped each other, remembered each other's histories. When those people scattered to Houston, to Atlanta, to Baton Rouge, the networks broke. Some families had lived in the same neighborhood for 4 generations. Grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, all within a few blocks. That continuity ended in a single September. The corner store where everyone got their morning coffee and knew your name, the owner never came back. The church where 3 generations were baptized, married, and mourned, half the congregation resettled elsewhere, and the half that returned found themselves worshiping with strangers. The woman who babysat every kid on the block was living in Texas now. The man who organized the neighborhood cleanup days had died in Atlanta. The second line parades still happen. Brass bands still march through the streets, but they roll through neighborhoods where many of the people watching are tourists or new residents who don't know what they're seeing, who don't know this used to be someone's uncle leading the parade, someone's grandmother in the second line. The performance continues, but the context is gone. The entire public school system was dismantled and rebuilt as charter schools, the largest charter district in the nation, an experiment in education reform conducted on a city that had no choice but to accept it. Before Katrina, there were 123 traditional public schools, serving about 65,000 students. By 2014, there were 7 traditional public schools left. The rest had been converted to charters or closed entirely. Whether this improved education depends on who you ask and which metrics you trust. Test scores rose, which proponents cite as proof of success. Graduation rates improved. But thousands of veteran teachers lost their jobs and weren't rehired. The teachers' union was effectively dissolved, and the new charter schools hired younger, cheaper staff. Schools that had anchored neighborhoods for decades closed permanently. Some students thrived in the new system with its focus on accountability and performance. Others fell through gaps that didn't exist before. The charter system could counsel out struggling students in ways traditional public schools couldn't. The transformation was total and irreversible. Even if someone wanted to return to the old system, there was nothing left to return to. New Orleans today has about 380,000 people, still 100,000 fewer than before Katrina, a loss equivalent to the entire city of Boulder, Colorado simply ceasing to exist. The population is younger, whiter, wealthier on average. The neighborhoods that were predominantly black and working class before the storm are now mixed or predominantly white and middle class. Crime rates remain high. In some years, New Orleans has led the nation in murders per capita. Poverty rates remain high, despite the statistical improvement. The hospitals that closed never reopened. The city has fewer hospital beds now than it did in 2005, creating a healthcare gap that hits the poorest residents hardest.
Housing costs have risen faster than wages. The median rent increased by over 40% between 2000 and 2016, while median income barely moved. When you visit New Orleans today, you see a vibrant city with incredible culture, and it is. The music is still there, the food is still there, Mardi Gras still happens. But underneath that vibrancy is an absence. The city survived the storm, it survived the flood. What it didn't survive was the aftermath, the slow realization that not everyone was coming back, that not everything would be rebuilt, that some losses are permanent. New Orleans is alive, it's just not the same life it had before. The recovery was real, but incomplete. The city that emerged was not the city that drowned.